thank you very much for dialing in. If I could ask you to introduce yourself and your business and share a little bit of your experience to open us up.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Lawrence, for arranging this. I was hoping to be with you there physically, but as you know, because of the special circumstances, I could only connect by online. So I'm glad to be part of this panel. I'm Ahmed Al-Brahim. I'm the CEO of the GCC Interconnection Authority. I'm in charge of the super grid connecting the 6 national grids of the GCC countries, mainly Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, United Arab Emirates. And this grid has been operating for the last 15, 16 years now. And we are expanding into more regions and expanding the capacity of our grid. The grid has been very important factors in developing the electricity market and the trading between the GCC member states, and is a major enabler for the clean energy transition, which we are trying to drive here in the GCIA. So again, I'm glad to be in this panel.
Thank you, Ahmed. I'm going to stay with you as we continue the conversation. I wondered, given the breadth and depth of the market there and the range of your own business, how have PPPs been utilised, and to what extent, and what are the features of the PPPs for your business to expand?
If you go to the government of the GCC countries, traditionally we have been using state funding and generated by, of course, natural resources, basically oil, to fund all our infrastructures. However, nowadays this model is no longer appropriate because of it's undermined by the oil dependence. There's a lack of workforce diversity. There's more growing need for public services and infrastructures that cannot be just funded by the states. That's why one effective response was to introduce the private sector participation. We've already have been using the private sector participation since the early 90s, mainly in developing IPPs. However, we need now a comprehensive strategic program for public-private partnership, because this model will now give us much more efficiency and economy and will add value to what we are doing. We are also undergoing the clean energy transition, similar to everywhere in the world. The GCC countries, especially led by Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Oman, they have pledged to reach net zero by like 2050 or 2060. And that have set big targets for clean energy development and renewable energy development by 2030. These targets reach up to 50% in the case of Saudi Arabia and around 30% for UAE and Oman. Now, such huge investments cannot be possibly funded by the state funding. Therefore, the PPP will constitute a very important means to achieve the clean energy transition and develop these kind of large-scale renewable power plants and meeting the energy transition targets.
Thanks, Ahmed. Christine, about your experience in advisory capacity, how are the PPPs that you've worked with or seen, observed in your advisory capacity, how have they enabled the clean energy transition?
Sure. So I think we can speak to a few things. So one is really the what I'll call it a vehicle, right, for enablement. And so you see PPPs emerge in this space where private sector can't do it alone, right? Also government can't do it alone, needs that private sector partnership. And so it's a great vehicle, right, to enable that collaboration. I think for clean energy especially, right, and we think about, and if you look, in US and Canada, we haven't used these in energy as much, right? We usually see like roads, bridges, stadiums, hospitals. But especially if you look around the world, right, South America, Middle East, Latin America, lots of PPPs, right, because it's a vehicle to fulfill that need. So I think a special one that my team was privileged enough to work on was a nuclear facility in Abu Dhabi, right, and that's a great example, like large, beautiful capex, new nuclear power plant, and really great collaboration, right, across like the state and different private companies.
It's interesting you talk about you've got a beautiful collaboration, which is a wonderful term for it, actually, to describe probably an optimal PPP. I wonder, Ahmed, coming back to you, what do you see are the different benefits of PPPs, for you and your business versus the traditional funding model? What were the real drivers of adopting PPPs, and have you seen those benefits come to pass?
Well, in my opinion, the PPPs will introduce more efficiency and economy to projects. Of course, as I said, reducing the state budgets and financial burden for the national utilities and rescheduling, these payments over long term. Aside of that, the PPPs can be used as a vehicle to like a transfer of knowledge, like to bring the private sector expertise into the local, utilize new technologies and trends, create jobs, as well as attract foreign investment, expanding on the local expertise and economies to reach better value in the PPP. So all these combines make the PPP really a much better approach than the current approach. However, we need to look into the models that are more appropriate to our region. I think each region has different conditions, and then you have to customize the model that really fits and works for your region.
If I can, and just maybe to kind of follow on that is, I think, and Ahmed's alluded to it, right, is that the model for public-private partnership evolves over time, right? And so what we see, may work initially to bring, capital and investment and human capital and intelligence to a certain region or to a certain project. Because we used to do these more in the U.S. and we've moved away, and now we have, and it's not a PPP, by definition, but we have, great public facilities where we have like ARPA energy. We have like the DOEs doing a lot of work. That the fusion, came out of Lawrence Livermore Labs. Canada has emissions reduction in Alberta, which funnels the carbon tax proceeds back into emission reduction projects. So there's great public examples of where we managed to establish, the mechanisms for, private funding, and we know how to fund transmission, and we're going to regulate it in this country. And then we have other vehicles that we can use to, to enhance like R&D and intelligence in the sector. So I think that model of public participation just evolves over time.
I mean, that interesting thought there, this public participation, and it leads me to think about the qualitative elements of PPPs. Obviously, PPPs are primarily designed to deliver infrastructure, an asset of some sort. But of course, there's a qualitative element to how you go about doing that, to the knowledge transfer you've referred to, Ahmed. I'm interested to hear from both of you about what qualitative elements are you seeing now written into PPPs, and have you seen those qualitative elements delivered? For example, knowledge transfer. Are you seeing those sorts of terms emerging now in PPPs? Ahmed?
Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, well, this is what we are hoping. I think, instead of just, relying on local expertise and local knowledge of these new technologies, the PPPs usually, they bring in more new technologies, more innovation, and this is like in a mean of reducing costs and optimizing the resources. So with this kind of approach, I think we'll always have much better operating model for the PPP than just the normal model. So you can see that always there is a drive towards better designs, better innovation, better utilization of new technologies, optimizing on all resources, utilizing resources. And at the end, we'll have a much better, efficient and economic project.
Good observations. I'd like to take you now into perhaps the application of PPPs and the opportunity set that they could present in developing nations. And in the, our aim here is to electrify 8 billion lives, and we're a long way from doing that at all, let alone in a resilient way. There was an interesting question from the floor yesterday about universal access to resilience, which I'm not sure if that problem got solved last night over dinner. But what role do you see PPPs playing in electrifying 8 billion lives around the world, and in particular in developing nations, perhaps leapfrogging that fossil fuel step and straight into a renewable world? Any observations there, any stories or success stories that have enabled sort of economic growth as a consequence of PPPs?
Yeah, so I think there's, and appreciate the discussion yesterday on Africa, because it's absolutely correct, right? Like there needs to be more investment, and one way to do it is to do a PPP, right?
Yeah.
And you need, and I will say that to make those like endeavors successful, you need the right partners, right? You need the right infrastructure and governance. You need to have, the right frameworks in place so you can evaluate and maintain the partnership and come at it collectively and constructively. We've seen a lot of those type of partnerships, have challenges when that's not the case, or there's ambiguity. But you need to have, there's a ton of opportunity, right, in a lot of these different markets, and it's about how you come at it, I think.
Yeah. You mentioned, Ahmed, did you have any comments on that? There was an interesting comment there about the challenges that can come with PPPs. I'd like to come back to that, Ahmed, but before I do, just wanted to check in on your own stories and how you're thinking about how you think PPPs may enable growth in developing nations.
Well, when you go to emerging economies and developing nations, I think usually the utilities will be more comfortable with dependable and proven technologies like thermal generation. This is what we see, and now the focus will be more on renewables in the new era, so that we have to overcome this kind of preference, to thermal generation if we want to have PPPs useful for transitioning the energy systems in the emerging economies. But the private sector, in introducing the private sector, well, they can present alternative solutions through different proposals by like international regional financing for renewable energy plants, taking into account the conditions of the countries, how they share the risk and the benefits with the states, so that they can make this PPP model more appealing for emerging economies.
Have you seen, in your experience, PPPs enabling and specifically incentivizing R&D? Have you seen PPPs in an R&D context? Because one of the gaps we talked about yesterday was funding for innovation and R&D. Government can do so much, business can do so much, but together potentially there's a leveraging effect that's available as we try and decarbonize our world, electrify our world. I wondered whether in either of your experience you'd seen R&D captured as an outcome of a PPP.
I would say we see, and Ahmed alluded to it, we see a bit of not like the knowledge transfer, right?
Yeah.
For sure, which is not really, R&D. But what we see the most are kind of the agencies I alluded to earlier, right? Around like it's a different form, right, of public participation and partnership. But at least, within the US and Canada, I think we tend to see it more there, the enablement in R&D, rather than a specific infrastructure project.
Yeah, the same thing. I was alluding to developing local expertise, like by employing locals and developing them, introducing it to the new technologies. But also because the private sector comes with an overall R&D knowledge that comes from the overall work that they do globally. So bringing this R&D into the local country, I think this is the way to introduce R&D rather than just jointly working with the states. So the R&D is really already there in the private sector as they come in to develop the projects.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier, Christine, I'm going to come back to what you referred to earlier about some of the challenges you've experienced in implementing PPPs. I wonder if you share a few stories with us about that.
Sure. So I think maybe one anecdote and then a good kind of observation on the philosophy, right? And, take a toll road, right, which is typically a good solid PPP, and the government's, overestimated traffic flows, right? They put a lot of guarantees in place. As a result, a ton of taxpayer money is then going into supporting the toll road where the economics didn't actually make sense, right, to build it. And this is that you could tell that story many times in almost every country. And I think what happens is there's something called optimistic bias, right? And optimistic bias is great, but it's challenging. It's great because it's what got us like the Hoover Dam, like Burj Khalifa, like we reversed the flow of the Chicago River. We did all these, built the pyramids. All these things are based on human ambition and optimistic bias, right? But then what happens is you get excited about your project, like we all do, right? And you start to discount information that doesn't fit that worldview, right? We need I live in Boston where we have the big dig, right? And it was 3 billion and then it was 20 billion. And, the price tag is, I think we've settled at 24 billion. 8 times the original project cost, right? And years over, And I'm not picking on Boston, it's just happened, many other places. And so I think, but again, you wouldn't have these beautiful infrastructure, right? Without this optimism and ambition. At the same time, it colors our worldview. And when we don't do a good job assessing risk, we don't do a good job assessing cost, right? And it may be, and I think it's important to go into those projects with eyes wide open. And it may be that maybe we did know the project was 24 billion and we're going to build it anyways, right? Because the economic benefits are there, like the long term, traffic congestion, all those reasons. So I think it's okay if we, eyes wide open say this is going to be a lot more expensive than we thought, but we know it's needed socially, right? Or for other reasons. But I think we tend to, have that optimistic bias, and then it's actually not helpful for the PPP and the large infrastructure projects because then they sound disappointing, right? And then people are discouraged to build more of them. Like Boston will never do another big dig right now after this, but it was really needed. And so I think it's just balancing of expectations. And being very clear about planning, preparation, risk assessment, right? Very realistic. And then it's also about, and we can talk more about this later, it's also about getting the right partners, right? How do you put in place the right structures, the right partnerships?
Yeah. And the risk allocation in there is something I'm curious about, would like to come back to and hear from you a bit more about. Ahmed, what about from your perspective, some of the challenges you've experienced in implementing PPPs?
From my perspective, one of the most challenging parts is about the local regulations and laws, which have to be really adaptive, and they should be progressive in order to match the changes and the international threats that we're having in project finance, and how the practices are shifting, especially during these kind of economic difficulties that we're witnessing now, like the high inflation, the Ukraine war, the post-COVID conditions, the supply chain issues. These all have to be looked after by adapting the regulations to facilitate these kind of things. Because hard regulation and laws, if they're not updated, they will be like a blocking factor for this kind of global business development. Another thing that we might have is the acceptance, the public acceptance of PPPs, because we still have certain nationalistic approach that we have to do this ourselves. We shouldn't have people coming from outside and doing it. So we have to deal with this kind of public opinions regarding that in our regions. Of course, the overall challenge is the financial market health nowadays, and how the outlook going forward is not really very clear. So I think this is one of the challenges that really we have to address when we are setting up PPP projects.
Well, I'm just going to connect both those conversations now, both those points you've made, because there's no doubt that there are supply constraints around the world that are putting pressures on, as you've identified, Ahmed. They are driving up costs, possibly imposing even more challenge to the optimism bias in business casing large-scale infrastructure, largely because we haven't operated in an environment like this before. And so I'm wondering there in PPPs that you're seeing emerging now, or perhaps recently, how is that risk being shared in PPP? The risk of long-term infrastructure build, it might be a 5 to 10 year project. If it's very large scale, you've got a private organisations bidding for a project. government supporting it, whether it's a joint venture or otherwise. How are you seeing those very difficult to manage inflationary risks and cost risks being shared in PPPs?
Sure. Yeah, Ahmed, if you want to respond, because I can follow on. Yeah.
Ahmed, any comments on that?
Well, I think that's like the $1 billion question. If I had
multi-billion-dollar question,
multi-billionaire, you know. But it's really difficult to address these issues. We have to really set up a real strategic plan, you know, considering all these factors. We need to be realistic, but we still need to account for these risks. How do we really account for these risks, and how do we build it into the PPPs? It's really a very difficult thing to deal with. It's not something that we have reached a solution with. I think there are lots of discussion regarding that in our region. But I think this is a very important issue that we have to address and be very realistic when we seek solutions for that.
And I'll add, and I don't want to take us away, but it would briefly on the IRA, right, which is kind of the elephant or the herd of elephants stampeding across America these days. And just everyone's got their own kind of numbers on what it means, right? But we know there's it's just shy of $2 trillion from the IRA, the CHIPS, Jobs, the Jobs Act. And the different estimates vary from, let's say like 700 trillion to 2 trillion being deployed just in the US, just over the next 5 years, right? And so if you just take a pause, that's 200 to 400 billion every single year for the, and we don't build this much, like just to underscore this, we the utility ecosystem, right? Electric and gas utilities, including all generation, everything else, we build about 125 billion a year, right, in CapEx annually. So we need to, and we've done work on this previously. We looked at, aging transmission. About a quarter of the transmission infrastructure in this country is pretty darn old. Before the IRA, there was already had to be, 700 billion in transmission investment before we're going to build all these new renewables. So when you run all those numbers together, what we think it looks like, right, is you need to double. Today, right, like double the CapEx going into the ground on generation and transmission, like double from 25 to 50 billion, from 30 to 60 billion. That is a huge undertaking. So the same way that our grandparents were like, where were you when we put a man on the moon? It's like, where were you when the IRA was signed? it's a really big deal. And I just would to take that run into the numbers really quickly, because I think we haven't really processed. Like, we know it's a big number, we know it's a lot, but when you say I have to double, right, what's going on? And we're at we're pretty low unemployment, right? And that's just the, like, I'll call it like hard direct energy CapEx. That's not the cable factory that has to be built in upstate New York to put the HVDC cable into the New York Bight wind farms that are going in, over the next 10 years. So there is just this kind of cascade, like, up the value chain of a ton of investment. And it's amazing, right? Like, we're going to build so many things, it's going to be magnificent. But just to underscore, we have to rethink fundamentally how we do supply chain and how we do labor, right? And we spend a lot of time, no one's been in this IRA environment, but like, we worked in the big build in Alberta. We're putting in, unprecedented transmission infrastructure into Alberta during high oil prices, right, in the utility corridor. And you learn a lot of things, but you learn how to make labor really efficient. You know how to, kind of prefab thing, like, you do everything you can, and they're kind of very tactical things. But how do we work around, like, the most expensive components of those projects, be really efficient to reduce risk, right? To make sure that there's no, we like to talk about, interface risk a lot, right? So, like, you've got two contractors, they work together. Is there a gap? Is, they're going to fight? Someone's going to leave materials in a yard and no one's responsible for them? There's like these like really tactical things, but when you add up all those kind of tactical construction items together, right? And you look at how, like, we need to, rethink how we do construction, right? We're not going to make it. The same way with supply chain. Like, we need to rethink, like, can we get, like, lighter, better materials, better towers, quicker? Like, how do we do these things? And so I think we need all the good engineering minds, right? And I don't think it's AI, like, no offense to AI. I think it's like actual humans and engineers. We need them to go and rethink, supply chain and components and commodities. And how do we do this, right? From the bottom up, we need to rethink construction. Otherwise, we're I think, very high risk of, spending more money to build less infrastructure. What we want to do is spend less money to build more infrastructure. And I know I have to do it safely as the number one priority, right?
ChatGPT is not going to solve that problem. Ahmed, I wonder if you have any thoughts on Christine's comments there on the, and again, it seems to be coming back to innovating at every part of the supply chain to enable the globe to be able to resource the build that's necessary. Ahmed, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think this is a very important part, especially that now we have to actually invest more in grids. For instance, in our case, because of the ongoing energy transition that's happening, we have to invest more in the grids. So we have to really optimize. We have to innovate so that we can really reduce this kind of investment. Saudi Arabia on its own, they're having just for the grid maybe 40 billion worth of projects coming up, and this is really huge. Now, how do we handle that? How do we address all the different issues? It's very, very difficult for us, like grid operators, on how to go about investments.
And I will just add, I think sometimes we get in our own way. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And like, there's definitely like, you need to have an excellent like planning and risk assessment, but at the same time, we need to enable, right, this build to happen. There's a nice article in The Economist the other day. It was like, hug your pylon, right? It's like, we need transmission. Like, we need much more transmission to enable this. And we need to kind of get out of our own way when it comes to things like permitting, right? Which probably sound like a broken record at this point with the rest of the conference. But it's permitting, it's enabling that energy ecosystem to come to life, because we have, put in place, and what I'll say is we need the infrastructure for the infrastructure, right? Meaning we need more people clearing those permits. We need, we need the right governance, we need the right mechanisms to be able to collaborate more efficiently, right? And not wait, we were talking yesterday, it takes longer to permit HVDC than it does to build it, yes. Right? And building HVDC is no joke, right? Yeah. And so we didn't need the infrastructure that enables all this build, like the soft infrastructure, right? And some of it will be, digital and AI, but there's also a lot of, human capital around clearing those roadblocks. And I think that's going to be really critical.
Now, you mentioned in your discussion there, you referred to some PPPs, multilateral PPPs, multi-party contractors. What level of complexity are you seeing that adding, and what level of opportunity is there for that to create good collaboration and to innovate around some of the delivery of the solutions required? I might come to you first on this one to hear from you, your perspective on the pros and cons of going from a bilateral to a multilateral PPP.
Well, it has its advantages. In our case, we are actually considering such model, and we're doing a feasibility study for multilateral development of interconnections, which will be involving multiple stakeholders, it helps to spread the risk. It helps to address certain issues which comes to right of way when it comes to different countries. So in our case, this is an approach that we are taking. We have been starting with some of our projects, and we see lots of benefit in that, especially in terms of addressing risks, in terms of addressing supply chain issues that might affect the project. Overall, I think it's a much better approach than just bilateral.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I'll add on. I think we both talked about it. The beauty of those coalitions, I'll call it, right, is that you can get the best expertise in the world, right, on a specific project. Yeah. And you need that because those pockets exist and they don't all exist in one entity, right? So it's important to be able to draw on that expertise across the world with some of these really big, complex projects. At the same time, it's about how you are really precise and thoughtful in structuring the partnership, right, to make sure you're getting the best resources, to also make sure that the collaboration framework is in place. That there's no gaps, there's no, that's the right level of kind of overlap and space for everyone to do their best work. And actually, the one thing I think about when I think, and we're working on a couple of large coalition generation projects that are really exciting, right? Yeah. And you can see where it gets challenging, where a coalition partner doesn't hold up their end of the bargain, or something happens, and because of the interface hasn't been prearranged, no one knows what to do, or everyone handles it, or no one handles it, right? And you can kind of see that the best partnerships are put in place very thoughtfully. An example I use is just the true test of a, PPP coalition partnership is really when something goes wrong, right? It's easy when everything goes well.
Yeah.
Right. Just to use a really concrete kind of, very, West Coast example, right? Like you building a big project, there's a bird that nests on a lay down yard. It's a very basic construction example, and you can't use the yard for 6 months. And so that project is now held up, because, and it was like, well, who was manning the yard? Well, I don't know, this guy, that guy, or woman, or whoever, right? And like, which party is responsible for that? And so like on these big capital programs, something is always going to happen, right? Guarantee you when they built the pyramids, they were like, there's some subsurface here we didn't expect, right? Like usually it always happens. We cracked a stone, like, something always happens. And it's like the test of the partnership is how well you're prepared. Like, have you done the risk mitigation, right? Have you thought through the biggest risk? Have you kind of brought them down through mitigation or other measures? Do you have the right structure in place in the partnership to respond? Because it's always going to go wrong. And so a good test is when it goes wrong, like how quickly can you recover? How much is the project, overrun by that event?
And to what extent do you think any large infrastructure project is going to come across its bumps in the road? And no matter how hard we all try to allocate responsibilities, accountabilities, and risks very, very clearly, they're non-linear processes in actuality, and unexpected things happen. I'm curious as to, in each of your experience, to what extent relationship management matters in the establishment of the PPP and then in its successful execution, knowing that throughout that process things will go wrong. Ahmed, I wonder if I'll come to you with that one first. What's your experience of the level of relationship management required through the process?
In our case, we always have a culture of partnering with whoever we're doing. Whether it's just a normal contractor, a partner. We have to be like in a partnership relationship where it's a win-win situation, and we start on that. So any issue that comes up, we try to really mitigate it by resolving and trying to negotiate something that addresses each party's interest, and each party's protects each party's interest. I think this is very important, and we in our organization we always build this kind of relation with our stakeholders, our partners, with our contractors. And I think this is very important. Rather than just having a very rigid legal framework, I think it's trying to mitigate each problem to have a win-win situation. I think this is very key because, as you said, there is always going to be bumps in any project, and we all know that. But we have to deal with it not from one side, but trying to look from all perspective and protecting everybody's interests at the same time.
Yeah. And I'll add, so in supply chain, you usually have material expediters, right? And they're just the folks who call the supplier every day. Are my towers coming? When are my towers coming, right? Like, where is my transformer? And you build a relationship, right, with that supplier. And so they know not to ignore your stuff, right? And so I think you kind of need that same concept of relationship expediters, right? They're just on the ground talking to everyone. When a problem happens, they know how to navigate the situation. And they've built that relationship. So it's not a negative event, right? Like, you're going to have, we've talked about all kinds of construction, other events, but they've established those ties, right, and built the relationship. And there's kind of actually usually a project culture that emerges that is kind of distinct and different from the culture of any of those entities by themselves that allows that, kind of response when you have an event. Yeah.
That relationship management concept and that constant dialogue with stakeholders does extend to communities. And I'm curious as to your opinions or views, experiences on whether you're noticing a difference in managing community stakeholders under a PPP framework versus an alternative method of collaboration or delivery. So, you talked about material expediters, their kind of role. There are other people in project structures that support community liaison. And so, Ahmed, you mentioned earlier that, maintaining your society's support for the program of work is incredibly important. I'm wondering if you've seen any difference with your PPPs as opposed to prior delivery methods how you're engaging with the community and bringing them along with your work?
I think the main thing is to manage perceptions, the perception of the community. I think this is the main thing, because if they perceive that the PPPs will be really coming to steal the country's resources and give them bad services, then there will be always some kind of opposition towards that. But I think it's how do we manage the public and community perception? How do we spread awareness that this is a positive and value-added approach towards developing the service and giving them even better service, maybe at better prices? I think that the trick is in how do we do that? So managing perceptions of the community and delivering the right views and visions about how the PPP will benefit the country and benefit them, the community. I think it's a very important factor.
And I'll add, so in Canada, we see this, and then Canada's done a great job, recently, of really incorporating the Indigenous and First Nations, right? So you'll go for a project and there's a requirement, you have to have a First Nations partnership, right? And so there's been, I think this has evolved over time, right? But there's been a lot of good partnerships where, because you're building infrastructure, you're creating jobs, how can we upskill different communities and make sure that they have the benefit of, that the land that we're going to use is right of way. So I think there's been a lot of good dialogue and good progress and great projects lately where you're really, they're really partnering, a true partnership with the local First Nations.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Christine, I'm going to stay with you and I'm coming to final questions here. So audience, if you have some questions for our panel, please be prepared to put your hand up shortly. But Christine, from your advisory standpoint, how do you suggest some of our members here, electric companies, do take advantage of these partnerships to create the most value for power projects to deliver the transition? We've got any tips for our membership?
Yeah, sure. So I think about the transition, and we tend to think of the energy ecosystem as a whole, right? And the lines are getting increasingly blurry. We need, for hydrogen, we need electric power, right, to make the green hydrogen, or even, to run the reformers on the blue hydrogen. And so, gas, utilities in the U.S. have always been highly intertwined, right? Because 40+% of our generation mix is currently gas. But you think about the ecosystem, right? And you're starting to see now, and especially with the IRA investment, so I've seen a lot of really interesting partnerships, right? Collaborations and coalitions where, we think we want to do a hydrogen hub, but we don't want to go it alone. And so we need 4 different partners. And actually, I think this is great because it's enabling the utilities, right? And other companies in the energy ecosystem to really reduce risk, right? Spread risk across, and get the best of the best of the, intelligence that resides in those different entities. So I'd say I would encourage, keep partnering. Do it in a very eyes wide open, structured way. But we have to build so much infrastructure. I don't even go through the numbers again, but in order to enable this, we need to have good partnerships. Right? We need to be transparent with and trust our partners. Right. So it's going to go wrong. Tell them before it goes wrong. And then on top of that, we need to, really reimagine how we get some of this done. Yeah.
It's interesting. There's a theme, Ahmed. I'm going to come to you shortly, but there is a theme emerging from the two of you that that these are slightly different to the traditional contracting out, head-butting sort of hard-nosed contractual relationships, and that there needs to be a degree of trust, of relationship build, knowing that you're doing such large projects. And Ahmed, I was wondering, with the massive program of work that you have ahead of you and adopting this new path to PPPs, what are your top 2 concerns or worries? What are your top 2 stresses that you're worried about in adopting this new approach to such large scale infrastructure spend?
Well, there are lots of concerns. First of all, we have to deliver things on time. So if there are any issues that come up with the PPP, we have to really evolve it. And with the complexities that might come with the PPP rather than the EPC approach, there has to be more involvement and collaboration with the PPP partners. And that takes time. And that's why I said, developing the relation is very important in doing that. Another thing I would say, financing is might be an issue with these kind of PPPs, especially with what's happening nowadays with the financial market. So that's another concern that we are having with the PPPs.
Can I just respond to one thing you said about the trust? So yes, but trust but verify, right?
Yes.
And good fences make good neighbors. So, yes, trust and love and all those things, but you need a really good contract, right? And so but it's, again, which is the basis then for very clear and good trust. So,
yeah, I agree entirely. Which is a nice place to turn to our audience and to verify some of what they've heard, perhaps from our panelists. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Good morning, Saifur Rahman from Virginia Tech. Very good discussion. I want to point out one thing that struck me as a professor: research in the PPP context. I heard Ibrahim mention they would like to see the research done by the foreign partners themselves before coming to the country to use that. I would like to suggest, unless you engage local researchers, engineers in this process, you don't leave anything on the ground when the foreign partner leaves. So I'll ask both of you, what do you think should be done so that when the PPPs are done with foreign partners, you'll tell them this is a precondition that will create domestic manpower so we can carry on the job when you guys leave. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is a very important issue. How do we develop our own R&D? And as you know, R&D requires lots of budgets, and we have to develop that. But I agree with you. I think using local expertise, especially academia, is very important. We ourselves, we are having certain collaborations with certain universities, but only for a small thing. But it does not really go for the level of R&D that we need for the development of grid. But I agree with you that we need to really work on that.
Yeah, and I agree also. And what I'll add is, the way we kind of measure, large CapEx and PPP projects is, are they on time, on budget, are they safe, right? How do you respond to events, as we talked about? But it's also what do you leave behind, right? It's more than just infrastructure. So have you left behind intelligence, in the entity, in the local country, or have you embedded capabilities, right, within that entity or that company? I think it's a great thing to think about.
As an investor yourself, maybe make that a point. Write it down, check the box.
Yes, yeah. Although I'm not the investor, I only advise. So, but I agree with you.
Okay, we've probably got time for one more question from the audience. Any other questions from the audience before I ask our panelists to make their final comments? No, we're good. Christine, any final remarks from you?
No, thank you very much for having us. It's been a joy, Ahmed, to see you, and James for moderating. And so we're at the most critical time, right, for infrastructure build, and it's going to be so exciting.
Yeah,
can't wait to tell my grandkids about it. But again, it's going to be great. But at the same time, I keep saying it. It's so exciting, and we have so much opportunity, and we also have then huge risk, right, of failure. And so we just need to be very thoughtful and very deliberate, right, about getting it right.
Yeah. Ahmed, anything final comments from you?
Yeah, I think we are in a very interesting era that lets us, on our toes all the time. We are running all the time, but I totally agree. This is a very interesting time that, once we achieve success here, it will be really something that we can tell to our grandsons that we have gone through this and we have prevailed.
Wonderful. And what a great note to finish on as we endeavour to grow to zero, grow our world on a path to emissions reduction, and the consequences of failure are no longer just some delayed financial rewards, but are in fact a more difficult world for our children and grandchildren. So failure is not really an option.